change the way that we live in the present? What if it was possible, or what if it was true, that prophecy was given to prepare us for when the future of tomorrow becomes today? And what I'm suggesting is that that's exactly why prophecy was given to us. It wasn't given to us to kind of scratch some curiosity itch that we have about what the future is going to be like, but it's meant to help us be more faithful here in the present. So now that we're all on the same page, that's where I want to start this morning. Let's get into our passage. First thing that probably you have questions about is this abomination of desolation, right? It's an interesting term. And what's interesting is the way that we're introduced to this idea. Because the way that we're introduced into the abomination of desolation is it seems like it's kind of a thing. It seems like it's an object. But then Jesus reveals that actually this is a person that he's talking about. Look at what he says. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not. And this term, abomination, it's used throughout the Bible many, many times. Most of them are in the Old Testament. And the word actually used to describe something that is detestable, something that is repulsive. It describes a way of life, a behavior of life that is just sinful and unholy. So the idea here is that someone is coming whose practice is going to be so abominable that basically they will defile, they will desecrate everything that they touch. And Jesus says that this person is going to be standing where they ought not be. Now, the place where that person's standing where they ought not be is the temple of God, right? So basically, let me just try to get your heads around this. This person that defiles all he touches will enter the temple of God, and he will desecrate the worship of God. Now, maybe you're asking yourself, or the question is in your head, okay, how do we know that Jesus is talking about the temple? Because all he says is he will be standing where he ought not be. How do we know that's the temple? Well, Matthew, one of Jesus's other disciples, in his gospel record, he gives us this same conversation with Jesus, but he adds some things in there Jesus said that Mark doesn't have. Let me share with you the way Matthew records this conversation in Matthew 24. This is what he says. This is what the words of Jesus. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. See, so Jesus reaches back and he uses this very phrase that Daniel uses. He uses this to describe what Daniel was talking about, the abomination of desolation that will be standing in the holy place. So I think what would be helpful at this point is to share with you the verses where Daniel says those things so that we can begin to get some clarity about why Jesus would use the very words of Daniel to describe what's going to happen to his disciples. These are the passages from Daniel where we read that term. This is what Daniel, and by the way, Daniel is prophesying these words centuries before this came to take place. This is what he says in 9:27. He's talking about the one who will come and do these things, these wicked things. And he shall make strong a covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. See, Daniel, way before Christ, is prophesying that there's going to be one who comes and he's going to put an end to the sacrifices and the offerings in the temple. One more verse with you from Daniel where he expands on this idea. Chapter 11, he says this. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. See, Daniel reveals that not only will this person put a stop to offerings, but he's also going to set up an abomination that makes desolate. Now, what is he talking about? Now, most people generally believe what Daniel was prophesying about was something that happened, an event that happened in the year 167 BC. And what happened in 167 BC was that a Syrian king named Antiochus Epiphanes, he came into Jerusalem. He outlawed the worship of God. Not only did he outlaw the worship of God, but he also entered the sanctuary. He entered the very holy place, which was a big no-no. You don't do that. That was abominable in and of itself. But not only did he do that, he took pigs into the very holy place of God, and he sacrificed those pigs on the altar of God. And then he set up an image of Zeus in the temple as an object of worship. So see, what's going on here is Daniel is prophesying. God is speaking through Daniel to his people that there's coming one who's going to bring an abomination of desolation into the temple. And centuries later, this came to pass. Now, Jesus, in this passage, is using that same language, the abomination of desolation language, saying that in the same way that someone came into the temple, the same way someone is going to come in the temple now, and they're going to do the same type of thing. And this happened years later. After Jesus prophesied this happened years later. Now, there is some question about exactly which event Jesus was talking about. And there are basically three main options that I want to share with you. I'm sure you've heard one, maybe all three of these options. What is Jesus talking about in our passage? So the first one is this. The first one, there was an event in 67 AD, which was about 40 years after Jesus was speaking to his disciples here in our passage. 67 AD, the Jewish religious zealots came in, they took control of the city. Not only did they take control of the city, but they just grabbed their friends, their buddies, and they made them high priests in the temple. And these men had no business being high priests. That wasn't how God described high priests to be put in that position. And one of these particular men was a man named Phannius, who was made high priest. And this man was particularly evil and wicked. It said that he actually let murders take place in the sanctuary. And not only was he evil and wicked, but he was also not very bright, which I find hilarious. Because as you read the history, what you see is that person after person talks about the ignorance of this guy Phannius, this guy who the Zealots had made high priest. Let me share with you what one historian, William Whiston, says about these high priests. He says, "Here we may discover the utter disgrace and ruin of the high priesthood among the Jews, when undeserving, ignoble, and vile persons were advanced to that office by the seditious." He's talking about them putting these men. He starts naming names. He says the name of these high priests, they weren't even high priests, rather these ridiculous and profane persons, were Jesus the son of Damnaeus, Jesus the son of Gamaliel, Matthias the son of Theophilus, and that prodigious ignoramus Phannius. Don't you just love that? That prodigious ignoramus Phannius. So that is our first option here, right? That is maybe what Jesus is talking about. Maybe he's talking about when the Zealots came in, they took over the temple, they put their own buddies and friends as high priests. Maybe that's the abomination that brings desolation. That's option one. Option two, maybe you've heard about this, but there was an event that happened in 70 AD where the Romans came into Jerusalem. They surrounded the city, and led by a man named General Titus. He was a Roman general. And what they did was they came and they surrounded the city around Passover time, so that the city was packed full of Jewish people coming to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. Now, the thing that Titus did was he would let people come in, but he wouldn't let people leave. And once the city was full of people celebrating, they started killing people and they started destroying the city. Then Titus went into the sanctuary with his standards and flags and banners and all the Roman symbolism that they had. He brought these things into the temple and he made sacrifices to those things on the altar. Then what happened was his men got all whipped up and excited and they started setting fire to the temple doors. Well, a fire raged. And if you know anything about the temple, it was completely covered in gold on the inside. It was all gold. So in the heat of the fire, the gold started to melt. It started to get into the cracks between the stones. So the Roman soldiers, what they did was they got pry bars and they started prying these giant stones apart in order to get the gold that was under the stones, just fulfilling the very prophecy that Jesus had said earlier in the Olivet Discourse. Do you see these great stones, these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. And if you go to Israel today, you can still see those stones that they pushed off over the side, standing there right where they left them. I brought a picture. We got to go to Israel in 2010. Here's a picture of me standing by those huge stones. You can still see them today. So that's our second option there. Maybe Jesus is talking about the abomination of desolation, that he's going to be standing where he ought not be. Maybe he was talking about General Titus going into the sanctuary and sacrificing to these symbols. Maybe that was it. Or there's a third option. The third option, some people believe that this has not come to pass yet. Some people believe that when Jesus is talking this, he's predicting about something that's going to happen in the future. Basically, he's pointing to the Antichrist, the one who will come at the end, who will come and demand that all the world worship him as the Lord, as God. And I have some verses I want to share with you about this character. The first one's in 2 Thessalonians. And it's important that you understand what Paul is saying in this passage. In 2 Thessalonians, Paul is addressing an issue. Apparently this church, they had heard rumors that maybe they had missed the day of the Lord. They had heard maybe Jesus came back and we missed it. So they're scared, they're panicking. Paul writes them a letter to comfort them, and he says this to them in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. So Paul is talking, he doesn't use the word Antichrist, but I think it's a fitting label for this man who's going to come and sit in the very temple of God, proclaim himself to be God, and demand that people worship him as God. Let me share one more verse with you that we read about the Antichrist in 1 John chapter 2. John says this, children, it is the last hour. And as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know that it is the last hour. So here John reveals, and this is important, grab onto this. Here John reveals that throughout history, there's going to be many little antichrists, but ultimately they all point to the once for all fulfillment of the prophecy, the Antichrist at the end. So those are your three options. Those are the most, I won't say they're your only options, but those are the three most common beliefs, what Jesus means by the term abomination of desolation, standing where he ought not be. And I'll tell you what many commentators think is true. Many commentators think the first one is true. They believe that Jesus is specifically talking about 67 AD when the Zealots took over. They set the high priests in the temple. And the reason that they believe this is because they don't think Jesus could have been talking about when Titus came in and surrounded the city, because Jesus tells his people, when you see these things, flee. But Titus would not allow people to flee, so there would have been no opportunity. That happened 3 years, 4 years after the Zealots. They also don't believe Jesus is talking about some Antichrist in the future when the whole world will be involved, because Jesus says, let those who are in Judea flee. He doesn't say anything about the whole world. He localizes it to Judea. Now, I personally think that those are good ideas. Those are good reasons. But I want to suggest another possibility with you this morning. As I've thought about this, as I've wrestled through this passage, I was wrestling through this passage, reading a lot, looking at it. But what I want to suggest this morning is the very real possibility that perhaps Jesus had all three in mind. Maybe not even all three, maybe more than we can even imagine, things in mind. And the reason that I say that is because often when we look at prophecy in the scriptures, what we see is that the prophecy is given and then something happened that kind of reminds us of that prophecy, that kind of has echoes of that prophecy. It doesn't completely fulfill it, but it does remind us of that. And that thing ultimately points beyond itself to the once for all time that prophecy will be fulfilled. See, when the Zealots took over in 67 AD, and they put that prodigious ignoramus, Fannius, in the position of high priest, there was a historian at the time, or a historian who was writing about this time named Eusebius. And what Eusebius tells us, he says that during that time, a word from the Lord came to his faithful people, to the believers. And those who believed and trusted in the Lord heard this word and responded. And that word from the Lord was this: flee. Flee Jerusalem, and I want you to go to a city named Pella. Now, Pella was a city that was about 40 to 50 miles north of Jerusalem and east of the Jordan River. And so those who trusted in the Lord and those who believed that he was speaking to them, they fled the city. They didn't go back and grab their stuff. They just left. They just fled, just like Jesus is talking about here. When you hear these things, hey, you just flee, you just run. And those people stayed gone. They did not go back to Jerusalem because they knew the very judgment of God was going to fall on Jerusalem for the way that they had rejected God, for the way that they had killed his son, and for the way that they had treated the disciples. So even during the time of the Passover, which was a huge celebration, everybody went, every Jew went. Even during that time, these people in Pella, they did not return. And that ended up being the very thing that saved their life. Because had they gone to the Passover in 70 AD, the city would have been surrounded. They would have been slaughtered along with everybody else. So what I'm saying is these two events, I think these two events, the Zealots taking over the temple in 67 AD and Titus coming in and destroying the temple and Jerusalem in 70 AD, I believe that these two things are meant to point beyond themselves. I believe they are part of the prophecy, but I also believe that they're part of the birth pains that Jesus talks about in verse 8. Look with me in our passage. We looked at this a couple weeks, but let's start in verse 7. Mark 13, verse 7. Jesus says this: "And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet." See, these were wars and rumors of wars that they heard about, but the end wasn't yet, because guess what? This month, September, this month, it has been 1,954 years since Titus came in and destroyed Jerusalem. Jesus said these things are going to happen, but the end is not yet. I would say almost 2,000 years. Yeah, the end is not yet. He goes on in verse 8. He says, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of birth pains." Jesus says these things are but the beginning of birth pains. So, I have 3 kids. Every one of my kids, when they were born, I was there in the delivery room. Some of you dads know what I'm talking about. All of you moms know what I'm talking about. Right? I was there in the delivery room. I was there for the entire progression of the birth. I know how it starts. I know how it finishes. And the beginning, relatively, the birth pains are relatively small compared to where they're going, compared to where they go before deliverance comes, right? But as that time goes on, the birth pains, they increase in intensity and they increase in frequency until the time of deliverance finally comes. And what I'm saying is that if these two things are just the beginning of birth pains, that would mean that we would, throughout time, begin to see things increasing in intensity and frequency as it gets nearer and nearer for Christ to return. So that finally, when the man of lawlessness comes, who demands to be worshiped as God, things are going to be really, really bad. Right? When things get to that last hour on earth, it's going to be the rebellion against the Lord, the rebellion against his people is going to be at a fever pitch. See, abominations of desolations, they've happened in the past, They're happening in the present, and they're going to continue to happen into the future. That is the nature of the age we're in. That is the nature of the church age. Tribulation. Jesus talks about it in verse 19 in our passage. Look at what he says. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. So, is it possible that Jesus is not talking about the zealots taking over the temple? He's not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, because I think that was pretty awful and I wouldn't want to be there, but I don't think that was such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation until now and never will be. You know, we're talking about worldwide flood that's happened. We're talking about the Babylonian exile. We're talking about the Holocaust. We're talking about nuclear weapons and civil wars in places. So it seems to me, this is what I'm saying. As we move closer and closer to the day of the Lord, as we move closer and closer to the second coming of Christ, we're going to continue to see these things increase in intensity and frequency as we get nearer and nearer in the time. So that's the terrible news. That's the bad news. But right, we set up all that bad news just to set up the good news. There is encouragement. There's encouragement in this passage, and it's in verse 20. Look at what Jesus says. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. See, in the midst of the chaos of this passage, Jesus reminds us, he points back to and reminds us of the sovereignty of God. He reminds us of our sovereign God who governs the affairs of men, who decides when tribulation starts and when it stops. And he says that for the sake of those he loves, God has shortened those days. Now, this is meant to be, I'm talking to myself, I'm talking some of you in the room specifically, that hope is meant to be where we put our trust. The words and the warnings, the simple words and the simple warnings of Jesus, the things that are clear and easy to understand. Our hope and our trust is not meant to be that we can map out or we can chart out, precisely, accurately, exactly what Jesus was talking about, how the future is going to play out. Because you know what, guys? There's mystery here. It's not exactly clear how this is all going to play out. God did that for a reason. He did that on purpose. Now, I know some of you that drives you nuts. I know some of you just got to know the details. You got to know how everything is going to work out little by little. I understand. Why is that? Well, I want to make a suggestion this morning. I ask that you just listen to this suggestion with humility, as I've been doing all week. I want to share with you what one commentator said about this, because I think it'll kind of maybe shed some light on why we ask all these questions. This is what he says. Like the disciples, the church throughout the ages has sought for infallible proofs of the end. This is perhaps inevitable, for certain knowledge relieves us of the responsibilities of waiting and watching. But the abomination that causes desolation is no such sign. It requires scrutiny and watchfulness. See, there's something about knowledge that relieves us of the responsibility of watching and waiting, doesn't it? Maybe this picture will help for you. So recently, the developers of this, it's basically GPS maps we use on our phone. Recently, the developers they've made this new tool over the last couple years that I use often. But I'm just going to tell you, it seems to tempt me or make it easier for me to break the law with this thing. Let me explain what I'm talking about. So what it is, if you use Google Maps, there is a tool in there now that will tell you of upcoming speed traps on your route, right? It tells you speed trap coming. And it operates in real time because it tells you you're coming up to it now. And so you stop, you slow down, right? And then as you're passing it, it gives you the option, is this speed trap still there on your phone, so that everybody else using Google Maps can now know if that speed trap is still there, which is breaking the law in and of itself. If you're going to say yes or no, you're playing with your phone while you're driving. That's besides the point. That's not what I'm saying. What I wrestle with, my temptation with that tool, is that I tend to speed between the speed traps. Right? I feel safe. That knowledge has relieved me of the responsibility I have to watch and wait. And I think that's exactly what this commentator is saying. If you and I knew the exact day and the exact hour that Jesus Christ was going to return, there's something in us. There's some sin nature in us that would break the law right up to whatever we thought was the final moment where we could get away with it. And then all of a sudden, right before Jesus returns, we put our hands on the wheel, eyes forward, seatbelt fastened, smile on our face as he returns. I think that's what he's saying here. And that commentator continues. This is the truth. This is what he says. The salvation brought by Jesus is not a salvation of knowledge. The salvation of Jesus is rather a way of following, a way of faithfulness, a way of standing guard at our posts, for no one knows about that day or hour. It is not a way of dispensing with mystery, but of living in mystery. And guys, as we live in that mystery, we're supposed to stay on guard. We're supposed to live like as if any minute Christ could return. It's not easy, but that's what Jesus calls us to. And I think there's some mystery here, because we wouldn't do it if we knew when he was going to return. We're also supposed to live on guard against false prophets and false Christs and false people. Look at what he says in verse 21. And if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, here he is, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. See, that's just not Jesus, right? See, when Jesus was here, as you read the Bible, what you recognize is Jesus was very hesitant to do signs and wonders. He was very hesitant because he didn't want people following him for the wrong reasons. If you remember in John chapter 6, after he fed the thousands with bread and they were following him, they were mobbing him, Jesus just very bluntly said, hey, you're following me because I fed you. I don't want you to follow me because of the signs and wonders. But false prophets, they will do everything that they can in order to gain followers after themselves. So keep your eyes open. Be on guard against those kinds of people. And I don't know if you've paid attention lately, but there are a lot of voices out there tempting to lead us away from Christ. May seem innocent, may seem harmless, but there are so many ways to deviate away from Christ. So be on guard. Okay, so what do? Well, we can take, predictions of the future and quote unquote prophecies that people give with a grain of salt, recognizing that no human being knows the future perfectly. Everyone thinks that they're the ones who are going to accurately predict things, but when the internet came out, there were so many predictions about what the internet was going to be like. So many of them. I want to share a few of them with you. In 2004, Bill Gates predicted that in 2 years, he predicted that within 2 years, spam would be completely eliminated. Here we are 20 years later, still dealing with spam. In 1995, there were predictions that the internet would never be able to handle very much traffic, and that the internet would mean the end of spying and the end of controlling information, right? If you've been paying attention, neither of those are true. So much information is processed and filtered, and it's all controlled. It's the complete opposite. And in 1995, Newsweek also predicted that websites, the internet, they will never replace the newspaper. There will always be newspapers. They also predicted that no one would ever do any shopping online. There's no way. And here's their reasoning. They said shopping online will never be a thing. There's not enough salespeople. But here's the thing. They were working with the best intelligence they had at the time. Looking back, we can see how ridiculous that is. But as they stood there, there's like, well, to sell things, you need salespeople. They couldn't foresee where this thing was going to go. Looking back, we go, oh, well, and that's the way it works, right? As we look forward, the future is always very, very cloudy because we're dealing with less information than we will have then. The past, hey, it looks clear. It's easy to see looking back. So I want to encourage you this morning, right? Hang on, trust in the one who sees all things clearly. He sees the beginning, the middle, and the end. He sees them all with absolute clarity. And he's told us the way these things are going to play out. He's left some mystery for us so that we will live waiting for him to return. So can I just encourage you this morning to do that? When we come to passages like this, hold on to what we know. What we know is going to get rough. He predicted it. There's something in that that's settling. There's something in that that's comforting. Hey, it's going to get rough, but Jesus said it was going to be like this. He also said that those days have been shortened because God loves me. He's also said that at some appointed time, known only to the Father, that he's going to return and he's going to take me home with him and I'm going to be in heaven with him forever. Those are the things that we cling to. Let's pray for us so that we can cling to those things. Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the way you're just like, you deal with us like the kind of children we are. You know our weaknesses. You know the ways that we lean. You know the things that we will do. And just like those speed traps, Lord, when we have knowledge of the speed traps, we tend to break the law when we know, all the way up to the point when we know when we can't get away with it anymore, Lord. So I believe that's why you've left mystery for us here, so that we can't predict it perfectly. We don't know. But Lord, thank you for the things that we do know. You love us. You've cut the tribulation short. You are sovereign. You are in control. And one day, you're going to come back for your church. And we're going to be in heaven with no more sickness, no more death, no more pain, no more mystery, where we'll spend eternity with you forever. Help us to hold on to that today and this week, Lord, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.